The church was silent, except for the whisper of silk and the measured breathing of 400 witnesses. Tatsuya Yamamoto stood at the altar in a custom suit that cost more than most people earned in a year, his posture perfect, his expression controlled, the kind of control that comes from a life spent commanding fear in the darkest corners of Tokyo. His hand rested on the back of a chair, steady as stone, though internally something was vibrating at a frequency that made him aware of every single person in the room, every shift in weight, every indrawn breath, every calculated moment of performance and observation. Around him, the most dangerous men in Japan sat in tailored suits, their women adorned with jewelry that represented old money and older promises. In the third row, his own mother sat with tears carefully positioned at the corners of her eyes. She had been crying, he realized, since before the ceremony even began, understanding the weight of tradition, the gravity of bloodline, and the way a Yakuza boss transforms into a different kind of man when he takes a wife and becomes bound by connections beyond the brotherhood. Outside, cherry blossoms fell like snow, indifferent to the weight of power in the room, to the accumulated violence and obligation that sat in the pews like an invisible second congregation of ghosts from decisions past. The chapel itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting, and then the doors opened, and Tatsuya saw her. Akira emerged through the chapel doors in white silk that seemed to glow under the soft chapel lighting, and Tatsuya felt something fracture in his chest like porcelain dropped on marble. He had been preparing for this moment for 6 months, had rehearsed every movement, every expression, every subtle gesture that would convey both tenderness and authority to the 400 people watching. But no amount of preparation readies you for the sight of the person you have chosen to share your life with, the person who has, against all probability, agreed to share a life with you, knowing or not knowing what that life entails, what secrets it contains. She moved toward him with her father's hand on her arm, and Tatsuya watched Kenji Sato escort her down the aisle with careful deliberation, one slow step after another. The man was thin, graying at the temples, with a left arm that hung useless at his side, supported by a small brace hidden beneath his suit jacket. His face was composed, respectful, the face of a man giving his blessing to something precious. Her face was radiant with something that looked like genuine joy, something that looked like a woman who had found her person in a world of 7 billion people, an impossible discovery in an impossible time. Tears were already pooling in her eyes, threatening to spill down her carefully prepared makeup. His chest tightened. What he did not know, what he could not have known in that moment, was that she had been preparing for this moment her entire life, not as a bride, as a weapon, as a tool of reckoning, as the embodiment of a father's deferred justice. And as she walked toward him, her hand trembling slightly as her father placed it in his, neither of them understood that the altar they were approaching was not a beginning. It was a reckoning of the most personal, most devastating kind. By the end of this day, Tatsuya Yamamoto, a man who had looked death in the face without flinching, who had made decisions that resulted in permanent pain to hundreds of people, would stand utterly pale, his entire world collapsing in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The love story began 6 months earlier, at a private gallery opening in Ginza on a rainy October evening. Tatsuya had not intended to fall in love. Men in his position did not have the luxury of love. They had arrangements, negotiations, strategic partnerships disguised as relationships, marriages that were carefully constructed to serve the greater purpose of the organization. His organization's elders had been pressuring him for years to marry, to legitimize his authority with a family name, to provide an heir who would ensure the Yamamoto lineage continued its reign over the Kanto region for at least another generation. They had presented their arguments with the kind of patient persistence that only old men possessed, men who had spent lifetimes managing power and succession. The crime families were evolving, they said. The world was changing. A boss needed a wife, needed a son, needed the appearance of normalcy that only a traditional family could provide. He had agreed to this arrangement the way he agreed to all things that served the greater purpose of the organization, with quiet efficiency and the unspoken understanding that his personal desires did not matter in the face of collective obligation. A matchmaker named Miyako had been brought in, a woman with silver hair and knowing eyes who had connections to both legitimate and less legitimate families across the Kanto region. She had presented 3 candidates over the course of 2 months. The first was the daughter of a pharmaceutical magnate, a woman with perfect manners and dead eyes, who seemed to understand that she was being offered as a kind of corporate merger disguised as marriage. The second was the daughter of a minor political figure, a woman who wore her ambition like expensive perfume and made it clear that marriage to Tatsuya was merely a stepping stone to something larger. The third candidate was the daughter of a wealthy but reclusive businessman, a woman Tatsuya had never met, but whose background was thoroughly checked and deemed acceptable by every metric that mattered in his world. And then Tatsuya was invited to a private gallery opening in Ginza, an event organized by a prestigious collector of contemporary art, an event that had nothing to do with his work and everything to do with the fact that he had recently donated a significant sum of money to the gallery's renovation fund. He had attended out of obligation, out of the kind of strategic necessity that governed most of his movements. He had planned to stay for 30 minutes, shake hands, make a small appearance that would be noted by the right people in the circles that mattered to his business. Then he walked into the main gallery and saw her standing before a massive painting of a winter landscape, and something shifted in him like a tectonic plate, like the earth was reorganizing itself beneath his feet, like the foundations of his life were being rearranged by forces he could not control or predict. Akira was different in ways that his mind could not quite catalogue. She was not trying to be beautiful. She was simply alive in a way that made everyone else in the room seem to be performing some elaborate stage version of existence. She wore a simple black dress and silver earrings, and she was studying the painting with an intensity that suggested the artwork might reveal the deepest secrets of human consciousness and the nature of desire. She was alone, unattended by any male companion, uninterested in the small talk and posturing that filled the rest of the gallery. When Tatsuya approached her, moving across the polished floor with the kind of quiet that was the mark of his training and his power, she did not immediately recognize him. She did not know who he was. She did not look at his suit or his watch or his bearing and think anything other than that he was a man who also happened to be interested in art. That anonymity was intoxicating in a way that Tatsuya could not quite process. For the first time in 15 years, since he had taken the oath that made him the boss of his organization, he was not the boss. He was simply a man in a gallery, standing beside a woman who cared more about an artist's brushstrokes than his net worth or his power or his reputation. "It's about longing," she said, without turning to face him, without acknowledging his presence beyond the auditory fact of it. The winter in the painting. It's not really winter, it's the idea of longing, the desire for something that's frozen in place, untouchable, but still beautiful because it's untouchable. It's about how we construct beauty out of our inability to have what we want. The artist understood that the most powerful paintings are not about happiness. They are about the space between wanting and having, the gap where all the real human feeling lives. Tatsuya listened. He stood beside her in silence and listened as she talked about art, about the way a single brushstroke could convey motion or stasis, or the space between emotion and its expression. He listened as she talked about philosophy and the nature of desire, about how humans create meaning from emptiness and loss. He listened as she talked about the small neighborhood cafe in the Meiji Jingumai district, where she spent her mornings reading, drinking single-origin coffee, and watching the way light moved through the leaves of the ginkgo trees. He learned that her family was wealthy but private, that she had studied literature abroad at a university in England, that she had returned to Tokyo 6 months ago to take over the administrative work of her father's charitable foundation. When he introduced himself as Tatsuya, using no family name, no title, no indication of what his last name might mean in certain circles, she simply smiled and offered her hand. When he asked her questions about art and philosophy and the way meaning was constructed in language, she seemed genuinely interested in his answers, in the way he thought about problems, in his perspective on the world. He told her he worked in business, which was not technically false. He was a businessman, in the way that many powerful men were businessmen. He managed assets, made strategic decisions, negotiated contracts, though the nature of his business existed in the shadows where law enforcement did not venture. She nodded thoughtfully, as if this explained something about him that she had already intuited from their conversation, some quality of precision or discipline that she recognized as belonging to a man who operated at a level of consequence. When he asked for her phone number, she gave it to him without hesitation, and he felt like a teenager for the first time in 2 decades, which was absurd for a man who controlled an empire built on fear and obligation and the subtle art of violence. It was absurd and also impossible to deny. Over the following weeks, Tatsuya discovered that falling in love required a kind of surrender he had never permitted himself, a kind of vulnerability that seemed to contradict everything he had built his life upon. With Akira, he did not have to perform. He did not have to be the man who had sent rivals to the hospital with injuries that ensured they would never work again. He did not have to be the man who had made business partners disappear into the night and into international incidents that no authority could ever fully explain. He did not have to be the man who had ordered violence in the abstract and lived with its consequences in the concrete, the awareness of pain that he had caused, pain that rippled outward in ways he could never fully see. With her, he could be quiet. He could admit uncertainty. He could confess that there were times when he did not know the right decision, when he was moved by impulses he did not fully understand, when he wanted things other than power and control. One evening, as they sat on a rooftop overlooking the neon sprawl of Tokyo, as the city hummed beneath them with the life of millions of people who would never know his name, she rested her head on his shoulder and asked him a question so simple and so devastating that he nearly broke entirely. "Are you happy?" she asked. He thought about how to answer. He thought about the year he had taken the oath, the blood on his hands, the violence he had witnessed and perpetrated. He thought about the men he had ordered to hurt people, to destroy them, to remove them from the world. He thought about the price of power, about the way fear accumulated in your chest until you forgot what it felt like to breathe without that weight. He thought about the cost of every decision he had made, the lives altered, the families disrupted, the futures foreclosed by his choices. He thought about the fact that he had not been happy in 15 years, that happiness was a luxury he had surrendered the moment he took his place in the organization, that with her, he was starting to remember what it felt like to want things other than dominion and respect. Instead of saying any of this, instead of opening himself to her in the way he wanted to, he kissed her. He kissed her like she was the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life, and for a moment, it felt true. When he proposed 3 months into their relationship, moving from a period of dating that felt almost dreamlike in its perfection, his advisors called an emergency meeting. This was too fast, they said, too reckless, too unlike the careful, strategic man they had come to know as their boss. Tatsuya did not explain his reasoning to them because he could not articulate it in the language they would understand. He could not tell them that she had become the only real thing in his life, that everything else, the meetings, the decisions, the constant navigation of violence and loyalty, and the weight of command, felt like a shadow in comparison to the hours he spent with her. He could not tell them that he had made his choice, and that the organization would accept it whether they liked it or not. He simply told them that the wedding would be in 3 months, and he invited them to attend. They accepted because they had no choice. A boss's decision once made was not a matter for debate. The wedding planning was a performance within a performance. Akira's family seemed genuinely pleased about the union, though Tatsuya noted certain tensions, certain moments where her father's expression would grow complicated when they spoke about the future, when they discussed the details of the ceremony, when Kenji Sato would look at his daughter and then look at Tatsuya with an expression that Tatsuya could not quite decode. He attributed this to the natural anxiety of a father giving away his daughter to a man whose background, while respectable on its surface, carried undertones of something harder, something less conventional, something that suggested his world operated by rules that most people would never have to understand. 6 weeks before the wedding, as Tatsuya and Akira were meeting with the wedding coordinator at the chapel, his phone had vibrated with a text. He had excused himself to read it. The message was from one of his intelligence officers. "Need to confirm something about your bride's family. Call when you can." That night, in his office in the basement of a legitimate construction company in Shinjuku, Tatsuya learned something that made his blood slow to a crawl in his veins. His officer presented the evidence methodically, efficiently, with the kind of detachment that came from delivering difficult truths as a matter of routine. Kenji Sato, a name from 22 years ago, a man Tatsuya had destroyed in his youth when he was still learning what it meant to command violence, when he was still becoming the person he would eventually be. Akira's father. The girl he was going to marry was the daughter of a man he had wounded so severely that the man had lost the use of an entire limb, had lost his livelihood, had lost his place in the world. Tatsuya sat in his office for hours after his officer left, staring at photographs of Kenji Sato from 2 decades ago, a strong man, healthy, standing with his arm around a woman and a small child, smiling at some joy that had since been destroyed. And then photographs from the present day, showing a diminished version of that man, his left arm atrophied and weak, his posture bent slightly to the left, as if the weight of what had been taken from him pulled him in that direction. The revelation did not come as a shock in the sense that it blindsided him. The revelation came as a shock in the sense that it clarified something he had subconsciously suspected, the way Akira had found him, the timing of their meeting, the precision with which she seemed to fit into the spaces of his life, the way she had appeared in his world, like an answer to a prayer he had not known he was praying. It had not been accident. It had been design. On the morning of the wedding, Tatsuya stood in a private room at the chapel, adjusting his cufflinks with hands that remained steady through pure force of will, when one of his senior advisors, a man named Ishida, who had been with him since the early days, entered with an expression that was carefully blank. Tatsuya did not look up from his cuffs because he already knew what Ishida was about to say. He had known for 6 weeks. He had spent those 6 weeks in a state of careful observation, watching Akira, studying her patterns, trying to detect the moment when she would reveal herself, when the mask would slip, and he would see the woman who had infiltrated his life with intention, with purpose, with malice. Every conversation became a test. Every touch became a question. Every moment of intimacy became an interrogation of his own feelings versus her performance. "Boss, we need to talk about the guest list," Ishida said quietly, closing the door behind him. Tatsuya continued adjusting his cufflinks. "I already know. About Akira's father, I know who he is," Tatsuya said, and his voice was very quiet, very controlled. "Kenji Sato, 22 years ago, the territorial dispute in Shinbashi. He was working for the Nakamura family. We were sent to send a message. I was part of the team that delivered it." Ishida's face shifted slightly. "Then I know everything," Tatsuya said. "I've known for 6 weeks. I had confirmation by my intelligence team 5 days after I proposed, and I'm marrying her anyway. Boss, this is a trap. This is a setup for revenge. Kenji Sato, he disappeared for 20 years, and suddenly his daughter shows up and meets you by coincidence at a gallery opening. This is clearly orchestrated." "Of course it's orchestrated," Tatsuya said, and he picked up his other cufflink and began to slip it through its opening. "It's orchestrated by a man who spent 20 years in pain, watching his daughter grow up in the shadow of what we did to him, and now he's given her the gift of choice. And I'm going to stand at the altar and marry her anyway, because that is the only choice that matters." Ishida stared at him. "I don't understand." "No," Tatsuya said. "You don't, and neither did I. Until I realized that I've spent 15 years in positions of power, and every decision I made was made in the context of violence, obligation, and fear. What if there's another way? What if the bravest thing a man like me could do is choose love over power? What if redemption is possible for men like us?" The ceremony proceeded with the weight of millions of unspoken truths hanging in the air between him and his bride. Tatsuya moved through each moment with the precision of a man who had rehearsed his whole life for the art of performing normalcy in the face of extraordinary circumstance. When Akira appeared at the end of the aisle, his heart performed the same fracture that it had performed in the gallery months ago. He still loved her. That was the complication. He still loved her, even knowing what he knew, even understanding that every moment of their relationship existed in the shadow of intention and revenge, and the careful machinery of a father's long patience. He watched her walk toward him. He watched Kenji Sato release her hand and step aside, with the dignity of a man who had learned something about grace. Tatsuya took her hand, and it was trembling, and he did not know if the trembling was from nerves about the wedding, or from knowledge that he had somehow discovered her secret, or from something else entirely: fear, anticipation, the terrible weight of playing out a role that had been written for her long ago. The priest spoke about love and commitment, and the binding of 2 lives into one shared destiny. Tatsuya repeated his vows and meant them. Every word was true in the deepest sense, even if the context in which he was speaking them was fractured by knowledge that she did not know he possessed. The rings were exchanged. They were pronounced husband and wife, and then it was done. The formal part, the public part. They had performed their roles perfectly. To everyone in the chapel, they were a couple in love, embarking on a new chapter of their life together. No one suspected that the groom was pale beneath his composed exterior, that he had been living in a state of controlled awareness for 6 weeks, that he was watching his bride with the eye of a man, trying to determine where the trap would spring. At the reception, held in a private ballroom in the Peninsula Hotel with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the expanse of Tokyo, Tatsuya moved through the crowd in a state of carefully maintained functionality. He smiled. He accepted congratulations from the elders of his organization and the business partners who served as their fronts. He watched his mother embrace Akira with genuine warmth, watched the way his bride moved through the room with grace and intelligence, the way she spoke to everyone as if they mattered, as if their thoughts and feelings were genuinely interesting to her. Every interaction was a question now. Every memory from the past months was a potential lie, a performance, a stone placed carefully in a trap designed to lure him into a position where he would be vulnerable. He danced with her, felt her body against his, and wondered if any of it had been real. He had given himself to this woman completely, had allowed her into the chambers of his heart that he had kept locked for 20 years, and she had done it all while carrying a secret that could reshape his entire life if deployed at the right moment. The uncertainty was its own form of torture. 3 hours into the reception, as the lights had dimmed and the dancing had grown more intimate, as the majority of the guests had begun to depart to their homes and their own lives, Akira pulled him aside to a private balcony overlooking the city. Tokyo sprawled beneath them, indifferent and eternal, the accumulated weight of millions of human lives, countless stories, infinite intersecting dramas playing out simultaneously. She was still wearing her wedding dress, and there were fresh tears on her cheeks, real tears, his eyes trained enough to recognize the difference between real and performed grief, between the tears of obligation and the tears of genuine human suffering. She looked at him with an expression that could have been guilt, or could have been love, or could have been the terrible combination of both. "I need to tell you something," she said, "before this moment passes into the past, before we go back inside and play our roles, before we lose the chance to speak in truth. I need to tell you something that has been burning inside me for 6 weeks, something I have been carrying like a stone in my chest, something that will destroy me if I do not release it." Tatsuya felt his pulse in his temples, the rapid percussion of his own heartbeat. He said nothing. He waited for her to continue, knowing what was coming, having known for weeks, but needing to hear her say it anyway. "My father is Kenji Sato," she said, and she watched his face carefully, searching for a reaction, searching for the moment of shock and revelation. "When I came back to Tokyo, I came back specifically to find you. I came back because my father, after 22 years of silence, finally told me what had been done to him. He told me that a young man named Tatsuya Yamamoto had been part of the team that destroyed our family, that we had lost everything, our business, our reputation, our peace. He spent years in pain, years in physical therapy, years learning how to navigate a life with a paralyzed arm. My mother spent years watching him suffer, spent years developing the tension headaches that would eventually hospitalize her. I spent my childhood watching my parents grieve not just what they had lost, but who they had been. The confident businessman my father was, the carefree woman my mother had been. They both disappeared into the shadow of that night." Tatsuya listened. He heard the truth in her voice. He heard the child she had been, listening to her parents' pain, internalizing it, building a life around it, constructing an identity from the debris of their destroyed family. He understood the years she must have spent in silence, watching her father move through the world with diminished capability, watching her mother's health decline under the weight of caretaking and grief. He understood what it meant to be the child of destroyed people. "I told him I would come home and I would make it right," Akira continued, her voice breaking slightly with the weight of confession. "I thought I would seduce you, and then I would find something, some vulnerability, some secret, some way to hurt you, the way you had hurt us. I came to this city with hatred in my heart. I was going to destroy you. I came to the gallery that night prepared to play a role, prepared to perform a version of myself that would be attractive to you, that would make you lower your guard. I came with a weapon, Tatsuya, and that weapon was me. I was going to use everything you had taught me about art and philosophy, and longing to make you fall in love with me, and then I was going to collect information, find vulnerabilities, and orchestrate a revenge so elegant that you would never see it coming. And now?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Now I'm standing here in a wedding dress, married to the man I have genuinely fallen in love with, and I don't know who I am anymore," she said, and the tears came faster now. The tears of a woman confronting the impossibility of her own situation. "Because I did fall in love with you, somewhere between the gallery and now, when you were telling me about your life, when you were being vulnerable with me, when you were trusting me, I stopped being the instrument of my father's revenge and started being a woman who loved a man. And I don't know how to reconcile those two truths. I don't know if what I feel is real, or if it's the performance that became so convincing that it absorbed the real thing. I don't know if I can be forgiven for what I intended to do. I don't know if you can forgive me. I don't know if forgiveness even matters in this situation." What happened next occurred in a space outside of time, in the way only the most important moments do. Tatsuya looked at this woman, his wife, his infiltrator, his love, and felt something in him that was not anger, not triumph, not the satisfaction of having exposed a plot. He felt understanding. He felt the terrible recognition of two people who had both been given roles to play, who had both been told what they were supposed to want, who had both discovered that the real story was more complicated than the narrative they had been handed. "I know who you are," Tatsuya said. "I've known for 6 weeks." He watched the shock move across her face, watched the color drain from her cheeks, watched the expression shift from confession to something that looked like terror. "My people found out about your father the week after I proposed," he continued. "They came to me with their reports, their evidence, their recommendations that I end this immediately, that I understand this was a plot against me, that I extricate myself from the trap. And I told them that I didn't care. I told them that I was going to marry you anyway, even knowing what I knew, even understanding that your father had orchestrated this, that you had been sent with intention and purpose." "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you marry me knowing that? Why would you do that?" "Because I knew the truth about what we had done to him," Tatsuya said. "Because I had been living with the weight of that knowledge for 22 years, carrying it beneath everything I did, every decision I made, every person I hurt. Because I wanted to see if you would still choose me after you discovered that I knew. I wanted to see if love was stronger than revenge. I wanted to see if we could find something beyond the roles we had been assigned. And because somewhere in the past 6 weeks, I realized that I would rather spend my life with a woman who had every reason to destroy me and chose not to, than spend my life in a position of power that required me to destroy men like your father every single day." Akira moved toward him, her expression fractured and terrified and hopeful all at once. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I don't know how to be married to a man who has caused my family so much pain." "I know," Tatsuya said. "Neither do I, but I think we have to try. I think that's the only thing that might redeem either of us. I think that's the only way forward." He held her, this woman who had infiltrated his life with the intention of destroying him, and had instead become the only real thing in it. They stood on the balcony overlooking Tokyo, two people caught between the lives they had been told to live and the lives they actually wanted to live. The city stretched out beneath them, thousands of other stories playing out simultaneously, thousands of other people making the tiny choices that would reshape their lives. The wind moved across the balcony, carrying the scent of flowers and distant rain. For the first time, neither of them tried to perform anything. They just existed in their truth together, holding each other while the world continued on beneath them. In the weeks and months that followed, Tatsuya made decisions that would reshape the entire power structure of the Kanto underworld. He met privately with Kenji Sato multiple times, listening to a man describe 2 decades of pain and the small, revolutionary grace of choosing to release it. He listened as Sato explained that the revenge plot had come from a place of desperation, that he had believed he had nothing left to lose, that when his daughter agreed to it, he had thought this might be the only way to reclaim some control over a life that had been defined by victimhood. But watching his daughter fall genuinely in love with Tatsuya, watching her struggle with the implications of that love, watching her choose connection over vengeance, had changed something fundamental in Kenji Sato's understanding of what justice might look like. It might not look like revenge. It might look like something far more complicated and far more human, like forgiveness offered, not because the harm had been undone, but because continuing to carry the weight of vengeance would only destroy more people, and he had already lost enough. Tatsuya began the slow, dangerous process of stepping back from the organization, transferring power to men he trusted, negotiating his exit in a way that would not result in his death or the destabilization of the structure he had built over 15 years. He faced the elders and told them he was leaving. They were shocked, scandalized, furious. The concept of a boss simply walking away from power was unprecedented in their world, but he had been valuable enough to them for long enough that they accepted his terms, a generous settlement, the safety of his new family, the understanding that he would disappear from the world of power and obligation that had defined him. With Akira, he built something new. They moved outside the city to a small house near the ocean in Kamakura, a place where the sound of waves could substitute for the sound of violence. He began writing stories of the life he had lived, the choices he had made, the cost of those choices, and the surprising possibility of redemption. Akira returned to her studies and worked with her father at the foundation, helping to create something that might transform damage into purpose, pain into healing. And in the quiet mornings, Sitting on their porch overlooking the water, Tatsuya understood that the moment he had gone pale, the moment when his entire world had shifted on its axis, had not been the destruction of his life. It had been the beginning of it. The pale face had been the face of a man coming awake, the face of reckoning but also the face of possibility, the moment when past and future collided, and for once, in a life defined by calculated choices and strategic necessity, he had chosen differently. He had chosen love. This is a fictional narrative. All images and videos were generated by artificial intelligence for entertainment purposes.